My name is Amelia Dutton, and I am 30 years old. Last month, my own brother shoved a titanium pen into my hand and ordered me to commit a federal crime. He needed me to sign a compliance waiver, taking full legal responsibility for his fraudulent tech startup. If I signed it, I would face decades in a federal penitentiary when his numbers inevitably collapsed. If I refused, he threatened to destroy my life. My parents stood right next to him, blocking the door and nodding in agreement. They were perfectly willing to let me take the fall so their golden child could walk away with a $40 million payout. Before I tell you exactly how I turned that same titanium pen into the weapon that dismantled their fake empire, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. But only do it if you know what it feels like to be the scapegoat in your own family. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that gilded ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, because the choice I made in that secluded hallway changed our lives forever. The Tuesday evening invitation was not a request. It was a royal summons. Inside the Plaza Hotel, the air hung heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and roasted orchids. My mother, Sylvia, walked beside me. Her manicured nails dug sharply into my forearm the moment we stepped past the velvet ropes. "Stand straight, Amelia," she whispered, her teeth barely parting as a waiter passed with a tray of sparkling water. "Julian, lead investors are here. Do not embarrass us." My brother Julian stood 10 feet away, soaking in the flashes of camera lenses. At 32 years old, he wore the title of Chief Executive Officer like a custom-tailored suit. He greeted venture capitalists with practiced charm, selling the illusion of his revolutionary tech startup, NovaStream. Sylvia and my father, Richard, hovered at the perimeter of his spotlight, basking in the residual glow of his perceived success. I remained in the shadows. To them, I played the convenient role they had scripted decades ago. I was the quiet, underachieving sister who processed basic data to scrape by. A journalist from a mid-tier business journal stepped away from Julian, gesturing toward me with his recording device. "And who is this?" he asked. Richard chuckled. It was a smooth, rehearsed sound he utilized during country club golf games. "Oh, that is just Julian's sister," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "She helps out with the little things." I kept my posture neutral. I did not correct my father. I did not mention my actual position as the senior director of due diligence for a massive Manhattan risk assessment firm. I held 2 master degrees in forensic finance. Correcting their delusions required energy I preferred to save for balancing ledgers. 10 minutes later, the polished veneer cracked. Julian caught my eye across the crowded room. He jerked his head toward a dimly lit alcove tucked behind the coat check, hidden from the glittering chandeliers. The charming smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a tight, rigid panic. I navigated through the crowd of silk and velvet, stepping into the quiet shadow of the corridor. Julian was already pacing. He clutched a thick, leather-bound legal binder against his chest. Sweat beaded along his hairline, shining under the muted wall sconces. "Take this," he ordered, shoving the heavy binder into my hands. "Turn to page 42 and sign it." He produced a titanium pen from his breast pocket, tapping it impatiently against the marble wall. "The acquisition executives are arriving in 20 minutes. The paperwork requires one last signature to clear their compliance team. Just do it quickly." I flipped the thick parchment pages. My profession required me to digest complex corporate contracts in seconds. I bypassed the standard non-disclosure agreements and liability clauses, stopping squarely on page 42. There, printed in stark black ink beneath a blank signature line, was my name, Amelia Dutton, Chief Financial Officer, NovaStream. I stopped breathing. I had never worked a single hour for NovaStream. I had never seen their internal ledgers, attended a board meeting, or received a paycheck from Julian. Yet, according to this federal compliance waiver, I was legally assuming the financial architecture of a company about to be acquired for $40 million. I looked up at Julian. His chest heaved under his tuxedo. His eyes carried a frantic, cornered energy. The trap was laid out perfectly before me. If I refused to sign, the deal would stall, triggering a microscopic corporate audit of his operations tonight. But if I touched that pen to the paper, I would instantly cross the line into federal fraud, linking my pristine professional credentials to whatever toxic assets he was hiding. I did not raise my voice. I did not swat the titanium pen away. I simply looked at Julian's trembling hand and took a slow, deliberate step backward. I am not signing a federal compliance waiver for a company I do not work for, Julian, I said. My voice was a flat, clinical whisper. He stood there, hyperventilating in the shadows of the Plaza Hotel. The smug chief executive officer persona melted into the terrified posture of a cornered child. His jaw opened, but no sound came out. He clutched the heavy leather binder against his chest as if it were a physical shield. I did not wait for him to formulate another manipulative demand. I turned my back on him and walked out of the alcove. I navigated through the crowded ballroom, bypassing the table where my mother and father were busy toasting their champagne glasses to imaginary successes. I stepped out through the revolving brass doors into the freezing Manhattan night. I did not walk toward the subway station. I did not head back to the cramped, damp apartment in Queens my family believed I lived in. Instead, I hailed a premium black car service and directed the driver to my actual residence in Tribeca. My family genuinely believed I was a struggling data entry clerk, barely making minimum wage. They needed to believe I was a failure to justify pouring all their emotional and financial resources into Julian. For the past decade, keeping my parents on a strict information diet was my primary survival tactic. If they knew my true net worth, they would have demanded subsidized vacations, expensive dinners, and endless bailouts for my brother-failed ventures. So I wore unbranded clothing to their holiday dinners and let them believe I was barely scraping by. It fed their narrative that Julian was the superior, successful child. They pitied me, and that pity kept me safe from their greed. They had no idea that my quiet data entry job was actually a position as the senior director of due diligence for a massive Manhattan corporate risk firm. I spent my days dismantling complex financial fraud for institutional investors. My entire career revolved around tearing apart corporate mergers, identifying hidden liabilities, and exposing executives who doctored their ledgers. I earned a mid-six-figure salary, and I lived in a sleek, minimalist penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. My world was built on verified data and undeniable facts, which was a stark contrast to the house of cards my parents inhabited. The ride downtown took 20 minutes. I unlocked my front door, dropping my keys into a ceramic bowl, and walked immediately into my home office. The space was immaculate, dominated by dual curved monitors and an encrypted workstation. As a forensic investigator, I never relied on emotion. Emotions fade, but routing numbers leave a permanent, undeniable scar. During the brief moment I held Julian's legal binder, I had memorized the 9-digit employer identification number printed at the top of the compliance waiver, along with the primary commercial banking sequence listed in the footer. I woke up my monitors and bypassed the dual-factor authentication to access my secure federal clearance databases. The glowing screens cast a pale blue light across my quiet office. I entered the identification sequence for NovaStream and initiated a deep structural background sweep. The search algorithm churned for 30 seconds, pulling tax filings, state registries, and commercial credit reports. When the raw data finally populated across my screens, the sheer scale of the deception took my breath away. Julian Tech Startup was a ghost ship. He had sold the venture capitalists a brilliant narrative about revolutionary streaming software and proprietary algorithms. But the ledger told a vastly different story. The corporate tax filings revealed that NovaStream had generated zero legitimate revenue in 3 consecutive years. There were no software sales. There were no licensing agreements. There were no actual products on the market. The primary checking account showed a massive capital burn rate, funding luxury leased vehicles, extravagant office spaces in the financial district, and high-end corporate retreats. He was running a textbook Ponzi scheme. Julian was funding his lavish lifestyle and paying nominal returns to his initial angel investors using the fresh capital injected by new investors. He was systematically shuffling money between external shell accounts to create the illusion of positive cash flow. But the incoming capital was drying up. His debts were compounding daily. The $40 million buyout from the private equity firm was not a celebration of his success. It was a desperate, calculated exit strategy. Julian needed the acquisition money to clear the fraudulent ledgers before the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. I scrolled further down the data set, narrowing my focus to the origin of the company. A Ponzi scheme requires a significant injection of initial seed money to establish the illusion of legitimacy before the venture capitalists arrive. 3 years ago, Julian secured his initial funding round to the tune of $4.2 million. To secure a commercial loan of that magnitude from an institutional lender without any proven revenue, the bank would have required a heavily verified guarantor. They needed someone with a pristine credit history and substantial verifiable income to co-sign the liability. Julian possessed neither of those things. My parents were already buried in consumer debt from funding his early 20s. I opened a new browser tab and pulled the scanned signature page from the original commercial loan application. I routed the high-resolution document to my secondary monitor, zooming in on the secondary guarantor section. The printed name beneath the stark black ink hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was my name, Amelia Dutton. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the bright screen. The reality of the betrayal settled over me in a wave of cold, sharp clarity. The signature on the dotted line was a highly practiced forgery. The looping letters mirrored my handwriting, but the subtle pressure points and the distinct slant of the vowels were undeniably the work of my mother, Sylvia. They had not just decided to use my name tonight at the Plaza Hotel. 3 years ago, my parents and my brother had secretly utilized my Social Security number to collateralize a $4.2 million corporate debt. They had intercepted my mail, likely accessing my discarded tax documents, during a holiday visit to bypass the bank identity verification protocols. They built Julian an entire fake empire on my back. If NovaStream defaulted on the loan, or if the federal authorities uncovered the Ponzi scheme, the primary liability would not fall on my brother. The bank would instantly target the registered guarantor. They would seize my assets, freeze my investment accounts, and drag me into a devastating federal indictment. By demanding I sign the Chief Financial Officer compliance waiver tonight, Julian was trying to legally bind me to the sinking ship right before the private equity firm took over. My family had unknowingly tethered their massive financial crimes directly to the digital tripwires of a professional fraud investigator. They planned to let me take the fall, while Julian walked away with $40 million. The adrenaline humming through my veins was focused and precise. I did not cry. Years of auditing corporate theft taught me that tears are useless when dealing with financial predators. I highlighted the fraudulent guarantor filings and initiated a mass export, downloading the undeniable proof into a secure, encrypted folder on my local drive. I needed to build a flawless, chronological timeline of their embezzlement. I needed to map every stolen dollar and every forged signature before the sun came up. I reached for my glass of sparkling water, keeping my eyes locked on the downloading progress bar. The silence in my penthouse was shattered by a harsh, sudden vibration. My personal cell phone, resting on the glass desk, lit up. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed an unknown number routing through an encrypted local server. It was not Julian's standard cell phone. It was a burner line designed to mask the sender location. I swiped the notification open. The text message consisted of 2 brief, chilling sentences. "We know you ran the numbers tonight. Sign the compliance papers by Friday, or you go down with us." I read the message twice. The threat was explicit and calculated. Julian had realized I was not the naive data clerk he thought I was. He likely utilized a shady credit monitoring service that issued an automated ping when my clearance credentials accessed his commercial profile. He knew I had seen the hollow ledgers and the forged loan. Instead of retreating, he was doubling down, choosing extortion over surrender. He assumed the threat of shared mutual destruction would force my hand. He assumed I would sign the chief financial officer waiver out of sheer terror to help him secure the buyout and quietly erase the debt. He thought I was trapped in the blast radius of his bomb. He had no idea I was the one holding the detonator. I locked my phone screen, placing it face down on the polished desk. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors, watching the final pieces of forensic evidence secure themselves in my vault. The battle lines were officially drawn. Julian wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate blackmail, but he had just challenged the one person equipped to dismantle his entire life. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and opened a blank target dossier. It was time to introduce my family to the consequences of their actions. The sun rose over the Manhattan skyline, casting a sharp glare across my dual monitors. I had spent the entire night cataloging the fraudulent ledgers and building a flawless digital vault of evidence. The anonymous text message from the burner phone was merely the opening salvo in their campaign. My family operated on a predictable schedule of intimidation. When covert threats failed, they immediately pivoted to overt extortion. At precisely 8 a.m, my phone vibrated against the glass desk. The caller identification displayed my mother name. I pressed the accept button and placed the device on speaker. Sylvia did not offer a greeting. She launched directly into a scorched earth ultimatum. Her voice dripped with a toxic venom designed to trigger the childhood conditioning she had instilled in me for decades. Amelia, you have until Friday night to sign the Chief Financial Officer Compliance Waiver, she snapped. The audio crackled slightly, highlighting her frantic breathing. If you ruin Julian acquisition Gala, I will call the estate lawyers. I will instruct them to permanently cut you out of your late grandfather will. You will not see a single dime of his money. You will be erased from this family. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, listening to the hum of the climate control system. Sylvia was utilizing her ultimate weapon. She believed she held the keys to a vast financial kingdom. My grandfather Thomas passed away 3 years ago, leaving behind a substantial portfolio of real estate and municipal bonds. Sylvia assumed she was the primary executor of that estate. She spent the last 36 months bragging to her country club friends about her impending inheritance, complaining that the probate courts were simply taking too long to untangle the paperwork. She had no idea the paperwork was settled years ago. Grandfather Thomas was a shrewd businessman who saw right through Sylvia's superficial greed. Before his passing, he quietly restructured his entire portfolio, naming me as the sole beneficiary and the sole executor. He knew my parents would squander his life savings to fund Julian endless vanity projects. Following his death, I quietly liquidated the real estate assets, transferred the capital into high-yield index funds, and locked the entire estate within a blind trust. I let my mother believe the probate lawyers were still arguing over tax codes because her delusion kept her distracted. She was threatening to withhold an inheritance that was currently sitting securely in my personal portfolio, compounding daily interest. I am not attending the gala, Mother, I replied. My tone was smooth and devoid of any lingering affection. And you cannot withhold funds that do not exist. I tapped the red icon, ending the call, before she could unleash another barrage of hysterical threats. I swiped her contact profile into the blocked directory. Depriving a narcissist of a reaction is the most efficient way to accelerate their panic. When Sylvia realized she could no longer reach me, she undoubtedly ran straight to Julian. With their financial leverage neutralized, my brother escalated the warfare to the next logical battlefield. He decided to destroy my professional livelihood. Julian believed I was a low-level data entry clerk working for a random corporate subsidiary. He assumed I lived paycheck to paycheck, relying on a minimum wage salary to survive. In his mind, severing my income would render me destitute and desperate, forcing me to crawl back to the Plaza Hotel and sign his fraudulent documents. He drafted a frantic email designed to execute a flawless character assassination. He accused me of severe psychological instability, corporate espionage, and theft of proprietary trade secrets. He demanded my immediate termination, suggesting that my final paychecks be withheld to compensate his startup for my imaginary crimes. But arrogance breeds carelessness. In his desperate rush to sabotage my career, Julian made a catastrophic tactical error. He utilized a basic internet search to locate my employer. He found the corporate directory for my firm, and instead of contacting a standard human resources representative, he blindly copied the executive tier. He pasted the email address of the chief executive officer directly into the recipient line and hit send. He had no idea that my employer was Apex Capital. Apex Capital was the exact same private equity firm currently preparing to acquire his Holotech startup for $40 million. Julian knew the name of the firm buying his company, but his narcissistic brain never bothered to connect the dots. He never considered that the sister he mocked for processing data was actually the senior director of due diligence for the institution holding his financial future. He sent a hysterical, defamatory extortion demand directly to the woman who controlled the $40 million buyout. At 10:15 in the morning, my secure office phone chimed. It was not a standard internal call. The glowing display indicated a direct line from the top-floor executive suite. I picked up the receiver. "Amelia," a voice echoed through the speaker. It was Catherine Sinclair. She was the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Capital and a legend within the Manhattan financial district. Catherine was a woman who built her empire by identifying weakness and dismantling fraudulent corporations for sport. She possessed a brilliant surgical mind and a reputation for showing zero mercy to executives who attempted to deceive her firm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority commanded the very air in the room. "Get into my boardroom right now," Catherine instructed. Her tone was a glacial chill that promised imminent destruction. "Your brother just made a very expensive mistake." The line went dead. I placed the receiver back onto its cradle. A slow, deliberate satisfaction settled over my nervous system. Julian thought he was sending a warning shot to a mid-level manager. Instead, he had just walked directly into the den, an apex predator holding a lit match. I unlocked my encrypted workstation and extracted the high-security flash drive containing the 40-page forensic audit I had compiled overnight. I slipped the drive into the pocket of my tailored blazer. I walked out of my office and navigated the polished corridors toward the private elevator bank. The ride to the executive tier was silent and swift. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling glass-walled suite overlooking the entirety of the financial district. The space was intimidating by design, featuring a massive marble conference table and zero decorative distractions. Catherine did not tolerate inefficiency. I approached the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. Through the transparent walls, I could see Catherine standing at the head of the table. She was reviewing a printed document, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. Julian had attempted to weaponize my career, assuming his status as an incoming acquisition target granted him the power to dictate terms to my employer. He expected Apex Capital to blindly follow his demands and toss me out onto the street. He failed to comprehend that data rules the financial sector. Lies shatter upon impact, but audited ledgers hold their value. I pushed the glass door open and stepped into the room. The trap Julian intended for me had just snapped shut around his own ankles. It was time to show the chief executive officer exactly what kind of company she was about to purchase. I stepped onto the top floor of the Apex Capital headquarters. The executive suite was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Manhattan financial district. There were no comfortable couches or warm lighting fixtures to soften the environment. The space was meticulously designed to make visitors feel small and exposed. Catherine Sinclair stood at the far end of a long mahogany conference table. Behind her, a massive digital projector illuminated the stark white wall. The screen displayed my brother's poorly drafted email in bright, glaring text. Julian had hit send in a blind panic. The message was littered with grammatical errors and erratic capitalization. He accused me of stealing proprietary trade secrets and demanded my immediate termination. He framed himself as a protective tech visionary, trying to shield a vital investor from a disturbed employee. He thought he was speaking to a generic human resources representative. He had no idea he was issuing frantic demands to the woman who held the purse strings to his impending $40 million buyout. Catherine was a legendary figure on Wall Street. She did not inherit her billionaire status through family connections. She built her empire brick by brick by purchasing failing companies, stripping their valuable assets, and liquidating their toxic leadership. She viewed incompetence as a personal insult and punished deception with surgical precision. She wore a tailored black suit that mirrored her clinical approach to business. She turned away from the projected screen and locked her dark eyes onto mine. "Your brother is demanding I fire you for corporate theft," she said. Her voice was a deadly whisper that carried effortlessly across the sterile room. "Explain." I did not offer a tearful apology. I did not waste her valuable time with a dramatic monologue about my childhood trauma or my parents' blatant favoritism. I walked straight to the mahogany table and placed my leather portfolio onto the polished wood. I unclasped the binding and extracted the 40-page forensic audit I had compiled during the night. I slid the heavy stack of verified ledgers, state registry printouts, and bank routing codes directly into her line of sight. "NovaStream is not a tech company, Catherine," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level. "It is a hollow shell." Catherine picked up the top sheet. Her eyes scanned the dense rows of data. I walked her through the precise mechanics of Julian deception. I pointed to the third page, highlighting the 0 revenue streams. I explained how Julian was running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, utilizing incoming capital from new venture capitalists to pay off the initial angel investors. I showed her the corporate bank statements, detailing the massive cash outflows, funding his luxury car leases, expensive dinners, and high-end corporate retreats. Then I directed her attention to the most critical piece of evidence. I produced the high-resolution scan of the initial seed funding application. To secure his original $4.2 million loan, he did not use his own capital, I explained. He and my parents secretly utilized my Social Security number to collateralize the entire debt. They forged my signature on the federal documents. He is currently demanding I sign a Chief Financial Officer compliance waiver to tie my credentials to his sinking ship before your acquisition team finalizes the buyout. Catherine stopped reading. She slowly lowered the forged commercial loan application onto the table. The slight annoyance she initially displayed vanished entirely. It was replaced by a terrifying, predatory stillness. Julian was not just a toxic family member trying to settle a domestic grudge. He was an arrogant fraudster actively attempting to defraud her private equity firm out of $40 million. He planned to take her money to plug his illegal debts while using her own senior director of due diligence as the scapegoat. She looked at the projected email on the wall and then looked back at me. Instead of calling security to escort me out of the building, Catherine walked over to a crystal decanter resting on a side table. She poured 2 glasses of sparkling water. She walked back and handed one of the crystal tumblers to me. A lethal alliance was instantly forged in the quiet space of that boardroom. We were 2 highly competent women, targeted by a man who believed his fabricated confidence could outsmart verified data. Julian assumed his charisma could override basic financial scrutiny. He had drastically underestimated both of us. Catherine took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. "We are not going to cancel the acquisition quietly," she stated. Her lips curled into a terrifying smile that did not reach her eyes. "If I simply terminate the deal, he will scramble to find another buyer and continue his scheme. He will find another victim to absorb his liabilities. We are going to let him believe he won." She walked over to her desk and unlocked a secure drawer. She extracted a sleek, high-security flash drive and placed it onto the table next to my forensic audit. "You have 48 hours to weaponize this data, Amelia," she instructed. Compile every single forged document, every hidden routing number, and every piece of extortion evidence into a presentation format. On Friday night, we are going to publicly execute his company. I picked up the flash drive, feeling the heavy weight of the impending retribution. The strategy was flawless. Catherine possessed the venue and the audience, while I possessed the undeniable proof. Together, we would dismantle his fake empire in front of the exact people he spent years trying to impress. But maintaining radio silence for the next 2 days presented a severe tactical risk. By ignoring Julian extortion email and refusing to sign his compliance waiver, I was depriving my family of the control they desperately craved. Narcissists do not handle silence well. When their private threats fail to produce obedience, they inevitably drag their victims into the public square. I knew my mother was already drafting her next move, preparing to spin a narrative that would question my sanity to anyone who would listen. The battle was about to spill out of the boardroom and onto a much more volatile stage, where my family would attempt to weaponize public opinion against me. I spent the following 48 hours confined to my penthouse, meticulously building the digital snare with Catherine Sinclair. The resources of Apex Capital were fully at my disposal. Utilizing my secure proxy servers, I pulled every fragmented ledger and hidden routing sequence associated with NovaStream. I mapped the hollow revenue streams, tracing the stolen capital as it flowed from new venture capitalists directly into Julian private offshore accounts. Every forged document was cataloged. Every falsified tax return was verified and archived. I was constructing a flawless financial guillotine. While I operated in the quiet precision of my data vault, my family was descending into sheer panic. Depriving a narcissist of a reaction is the equivalent of cutting off their oxygen supply. They expected me to answer their frantic phone calls. They assumed I would engage in endless, tearful arguments defending my position, while they systematically wore down my boundaries. By remaining entirely silent, I locked them in a void of their own making. Julian was staring down the barrel of an impending catastrophe. If I did not sign that forged corporate waiver, the Apex Capital Compliance Division would halt the $40 million acquisition. A stalled buyout of that magnitude would immediately trigger a mandatory inquiry from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Federal auditors would descend upon his startup, tearing through his records and exposing the Ponzi scheme within days. He needed my signature to legitimize the structure and quietly erase his crimes. Time was rapidly running out, and my refusal to engage was driving him to the brink of insanity. To regain control of the narrative, my parents resorted to their favorite historical tactic. They deployed a calculated campaign of public gaslighting. My mother, Sylvia, recognized that her private threats regarding my grandfather estate held zero leverage. She needed a broader audience to validate her victimhood and paint me as the villain. On Thursday morning, I monitored my locked personal accounts through a secondary firewall. Sylvia uploaded a highly produced video to her primary social media feed. The performance was worthy of a cinematic award. She positioned herself on the plush velvet sofa of her living room, ensuring the expensive artwork and curated floral arrangements were perfectly visible in the background. She wore a soft beige cashmere sweater designed to project the image of a vulnerable, loving matriarch. "I am coming to you all today with a very heavy heart," Sylvia began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She dabbed the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue. Many of you know my daughter, Amelia. Recently, she has been struggling with some severe psychological challenges. She has suffered a total psychiatric breakdown. I watched the high-definition video play on my monitor, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady. For my entire childhood, Sylvia had weaponized my quiet, analytical nature. While Julian was loud and demanding, requiring constant attention, I preferred the solitude of books and numbers. Sylvia always framed my independence as a defect, labeling me as antisocial or difficult to manage. Now she was escalating that lifelong marginalization into a full psychiatric emergency for public consumption. "We love Amelia so much," Sylvia whispered, staring mournfully directly into the camera lens. But her illness has made her dangerously jealous of her brother. Julian is about to finalize a massive tech buyout, and Amelia is actively trying to sabotage his success out of sheer spite. We are praying she seeks professional help, but until she recovers, we must protect Julian from her toxicity. The video executed a flawless character assassination. She spun a narrative portraying me as a deeply disturbed, bitter woman trapped in a low-wage job trying to tear down my brilliant empire. Below the video, the comments section morphed into a digital echo chamber of misplaced sympathy. Extended family members, country club acquaintances, and Julian's fake business partners flooded the thread with comforting platitudes and prayer hands. Then came the direct attacks. The flying monkeys were deployed with ruthless efficiency. My phone began to vibrate relentlessly with incoming messages from relatives who had ignored my existence for years. Aunt Beatrice, who had not bothered to call me since my college graduation, sent a massive paragraph of vitriol. "How dare you try to destroy your own brother, you selfish monster," her text read. "Your parents gave you everything, and you repay them with this sick jealousy. You need to be institutionalized." My cousin Greg followed suit minutes later. "You are a disgrace to this family, Amelia. Leave Julian alone before we force you out entirely." Dozens of abusive messages poured into my inbox, calling me toxic, bitter, and deranged. They demanded I apologize to Julian and step out of his way. I did not reply to a single text. I did not block the numbers. I simply took high-resolution screenshots of every hateful sentence and filed them into my encrypted evidence vault. Let them dig their social graves deeper. I allowed the smear campaign to rage unchecked because every tearful post Sylvia published only cemented their eventual ruin. A crazy woman cannot be a credible witness to grand larceny. They needed the world to believe I was insane to protect their financial fraud. My continued silence proved too heavy a burden for Julian to carry. He thrived on conflict and intimidation. My lack of response starved his ego and amplified his terror. By Thursday night, the pressure of the impending Friday gala shattered whatever rudimentary caution he possessed. He realized his phone calls and text messages were bouncing off a brick wall. He needed to strike a nerve, and he decided to use the heaviest hammer available. Julian bypassed my personal cell phone entirely. He sat down at his computer and drafted a direct message to my professional corporate email address. He still believed I was a generic data entry clerk working for Apex Capital. He had no idea that the firm he was emailing was the exact same entity preparing to purchase his hollow startup. At 9:15 in the evening, the notification chimed on my secure workstation. The sender was Julian. The subject line was empty. "I will tell the Securities and Exchange Commission you masterminded the offshore accounts if you do not sign by tomorrow," his email read. The text was blunt, frantic, and entirely unhinged. "I have the documents ready to implicate you, Amelia. You sign the Chief Financial Officer compliance papers, or you go to federal prison instead of me. See you at the gala, sis." I stared at the glowing text on my monitor. The sheer, breathtaking stupidity of his action washed over me in a wave of cold satisfaction. Julian had just crossed a fatal legal boundary. He was no longer just a toxic brother throwing tantrums in a hotel hallway. He had just typed a literal threat to frame an innocent party for federal financial crimes. He had sent an overt extortion demand utilizing electronic communications across state lines. He had just put federal blackmail, in writing, on a monitored corporate server belonging to the private equity firm evaluating his acquisition. Julian thought he had delivered the ultimate checkmate. He believed the threat of an SEC investigation would terrify me into submission, forcing me to arrive at the Plaza Hotel and sign my life away. He handed me the final, undeniable nail for his own coffin. The forensic audit was complete. The extortion was documented. The trap was fully constructed and waiting for the prey to step inside. But to execute the perfect ambush, you must first convince the target that they have won. You cannot chase a predator through the open woods. You must lie down in the tall grass, expose your throat, and pretend to be wounded. It was time to break my silence and offer Julian the exact surrender he was waiting for, while uncovering a final, devastating secret my parents had buried in the ledgers. To catch a predator, you must first lie down in the tall grass and expose your throat. You must suppress every instinct that urges you to fight back, and instead offer them the exact illusion of victory they crave. Friday morning arrived with a biting chill sweeping off the Hudson River. I sat at the glass desk in my Tribeca penthouse, staring at Julian federal blackmail threat glowing on my encrypted monitor. He had crossed the final legal boundary by threatening to frame me for his offshore tax evasion. It was time to spring the trap. I opened a new email draft addressed to my brother. I stripped away my professional vocabulary and analytical tone. I deliberately utilized the passive, hesitant language of the scapegoat my family had conditioned me to be for 3 decades. Julian, I am sorry, I typed, allowing the cursor to blink steadily at the end of the sentence. My erratic behavior over the past few days clouded my judgment. I do not want to ruin your night or hurt the family. I will be at the Plaza Hotel this evening. I will sign the Chief Financial Officer compliance waiver so the $40 million acquisition can proceed. I hit send. I did not have to wait long. The response arrived in my inbox less than 3 minutes later. Julian was likely sitting in his luxury leased apartment staring obsessively at his phone, sweating through his designer sheets. His reply was a masterclass in unearned superiority. I knew you would come to your senses, Amelia, his message read. Do not wear anything cheap to my gala. See you tonight. He genuinely believed he had broken me. He thought his frantic threats of Securities and Exchange Commission intervention had terrified me into total submission. In his arrogant mind, the natural order of the universe had been restored. The golden child was about to receive his massive payout, and the underachieving sister was returning to her rightful place in the shadows, ready to silently absorb his toxic liabilities. He assumed the war was over. I closed my laptop and took a premium black car directly to the Apex Capital headquarters in the financial district. Catherine Sinclair was already waiting for me in the secure executive printing room adjacent to her boardroom. We were not merely planning a verbal confrontation for the gala that evening. Verbal arguments leave room for denial and manipulation. My family thrived in the gray areas of emotional warfare, twisting words to suit their victim narrative. We were engineering a documented public execution. We needed undeniable physical evidence. Catherine and I utilized the firm high-capacity commercial printers. We produced 100 high-resolution, legally certified copies of Julian fraudulent ledgers. We printed the independent forensic analysis of the forged $4.2 million initial seed funding application, clearly highlighting my mother's signature on the guarantor line. We appended the printed screenshots of his documented extortion threats, including the final email where he promised to frame me for federal financial crimes. The heavy printers churned rhythmically, filling the sterile room with the sharp scent of warm ink and premium parchment paper. Catherine stood by the sorting table, reviewing the cover sheets with a cold, calculated satisfaction. She was a billionaire chief executive officer, about to demonstrate exactly what happens when a con artist attempts to infiltrate her portfolio. While the machines collated the final dossiers, I ran one last structural data sweep on my secure tablet. As a senior director of due diligence, you always check the perimeter of a target one last time before finalizing a forensic report. I wanted to trace the most recent capital injections into NovaStream. Julian had to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat for the past 6 months while negotiating the Apex Capital buyout. New investor money had dried up long ago. He needed a silent bridge loan to maintain the illusion of liquidity and keep the leased sports cars in his driveway. I tracked the routing numbers of a recent $500,000 deposit into his primary corporate account. It did not originate from an institutional venture capital firm. It originated from a regional retail bank located in Westchester. I pulled the property records from my parents' pristine family home. The truth materialized on my screen in stark black and white text, hitting me with a wave of profound clarity. Richard and Sylvia had secretly taken out a massive secondary mortgage on their primary residence. They had leveraged every ounce of equity they possessed in their suburban kingdom to inject emergency cash into Julian's failing startup. They were drowning in secret debt. The retail bank had already issued a preliminary notice of default due to 90 days of missed premium payments. My parents were banking entirely on Catherine's $40 million payout to save them from imminent foreclosure. The hypocrisy of their actions was staggering. For the past 48 hours, Sylvia had been posting tearful videos online, portraying me as a jealous, unstable villain who wanted to destroy her brother's happiness. She commanded an army of extended relatives to harass my phone with hateful messages. She played the role of the tragic, wealthy matriarch, suffering the burden of a defective daughter. But behind the curated floral arrangements and the cashmere sweaters, my parents were fighting off impending bankruptcy. They had bet their entire financial existence on Julian's fraudulent empire. If the Apex Capital acquisition failed, they would not just lose their elevated social standing at the country club, they would lose the literal roof over their heads. The bank would seize the Westchester estate and auction it off to the highest bidder. They were cornered animals. They used the fabricated narrative of my mental breakdown to force my compliance because their actual survival depended entirely on my signature. They needed me to assume the liability of the Ponzi scheme so Julian could collect the buyout funds and quietly pay off their secondary mortgage before the eviction notices arrived. They were perfectly willing to let me face decades in a federal penitentiary just so they could keep their manicured lawn. I stared at the secondary mortgage filing on my tablet. Any residual trace of familial obligation I might have harbored evaporated instantly. The invisible chain tethering me to their dysfunction simply snapped. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable asset, an insurance policy meant to be cashed out when their primary investment failed. Catherine noticed the shift in my posture. She walked over and glanced down at the illuminated screen of my tablet. She read the foreclosure warning and the secondary lien details. A dark, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. They tied their own nooses, Catherine noted, her voice smooth and devoid of pity. We just have to let them step off the platform. I gathered the 100 certified dossiers from the sorting table. I slid the thick stacks of premium parchment paper into sleek black leather portfolios. The physical weight of the documents was substantial. It felt like carrying the condensed ruin of an entire family line in my hands. The paper trail was flawless, mapping a linear, undeniable story of greed, forgery, and desperate extortion. I returned to my Tribeca penthouse to prepare for the evening. Julian had explicitly instructed me not to wear anything cheap. He wanted me to blend into the background of his high society event, but still look presentable enough for the photographs. I bypassed the discounted dresses my mother usually forced upon me. I pulled a tailored designer charcoal suit from my closet. It was a garment that commanded authority, radiating the quiet power of a woman who destroyed corporate fraud for a living. I secured the leather portfolios inside a structured black briefcase. The sun began to set over the Hudson River, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of my apartment. The final pieces were locked into position. My family was currently standing in the gilded ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, drinking vintage champagne funded by a fraudulent secondary mortgage. They were waiting for the arrival of a broken, compliant sister, ready to quietly sign her life away in a dark alcove. I stepped out into the hallway and summoned the elevator. I was bringing a financial autopsy. Friday evening descended upon Manhattan, bringing a biting winter wind that rattled the glass facades of the financial district. Inside the Plaza Hotel, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a masterpiece of manufactured wealth. Hundreds of New York elite mingled beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with premium caviar and vintage champagne. The opulence was blinding. The attendees believed they were celebrating the crowning achievement of a brilliant tech visionary. My trained eyes saw only a meticulously decorated crime scene. Every sip of that expensive sparkling wine, every floral arrangement, and every hour of the string quartet playing softly in the corner was funded by stolen capital. Richard and Sylvia had mortgaged their pristine suburban home to the hilt, draining their final drop of equity to rent this room. They were hosting a party on the deck of a sinking ship. I handed my wool overcoat to the lobby attendant, but I retained my structured black leather briefcase. It held the 100 certified forensic dossiers detailing the exact anatomy of my family deception. I turned and walked toward the grand archway of the ballroom. I did not wear the pastel off-the-rack dresses my mother usually selected for me. For 3 decades, Sylvia curated my wardrobe with a specific psychological goal. She utilized cheap fabrics, poor tailoring, and drab colors to visually cement my status as the lesser sibling. Whenever we took family holiday photographs, Julian wore tailored suits, while I was handed faded cardigans. She designed my appearance to ensure Julian always shined brighter by comparison. She wanted the world to view me as a tragic charity case. Tonight, I dismantled her visual hierarchy. I wore a tailored designer charcoal suit. The Italian wool draped perfectly across my shoulders, projecting the sharp, unyielding authority of a senior director of due diligence. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors as I stepped into the sea of silk and velvet. I did not shrink into the background. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of an auditor arriving to balance a fraudulent ledger. Sylvia spotted me instantly. Her radar for controlling optics was unmatched. She detached herself from a circle of wealthy venture capitalists and moved rapidly across the floor. Her sequined gown dragged heavily against the stone tiles. Before I could reach the center of the room, her fingers clamped around my wrist like a steel vise. She plastered a wide, theatrical smile onto her face, turning back toward the group of investors she had just abandoned. "There is our troubled girl," Sylvia announced. Her voice projected loudly, designed to carry over the ambient hum of the ballroom. The venture capitalists offered tight, uncomfortable smiles. They clutched their crystal flutes, unsure how to respond to a mother openly degrading her daughter at a corporate gala. Sylvia tightened her grip on my wrist, her acrylic nails biting into the fine wool of my suit sleeve. "Julian, the pride of this family, is so forgiving to let her be part of his big night," Sylvia continued, playing the role of the benevolent, long-suffering matriarch. "We just hope the stress of the crowd is not too much for her delicate condition." She turned her head slightly, leaning in close to my ear. Her heavy, expensive perfume was thick and suffocating. "You look ridiculous," she hissed through gritted teeth, the fake smile never leaving her face. "You look like a miserable corporate drone. Get into the back room right now before you ruin the photographs. Julian is waiting for you." I did not pull my wrist away. I did not flinch or offer a defensive response. I simply looked down at her hand and then up into her panicked eyes. The sheer desperation radiating from her skin was palpable. She was standing inches away from total financial ruin, pretending she owned the building. Julian materialized from the crowd before she could issue another threat. He was flanked by 3 men wearing expensive watches and tailored tuxedos. They were his supposed board of directors, a collection of sycophants who likely knew nothing about the hollow revenue streams or the forged commercial loans. Julian looked euphoric. He practically vibrated with the anticipation of his impending $40 million payout. His eyes darted around the room, tracking the Apex Capital executives mingling near the main stage. When he saw me standing next to our mother, a flash of arrogant relief washed over his face. He truly believed his federal blackmail email had worked. He assumed the threat of an SEC investigation had terrified me into total submission. He thought I was walking into the slaughterhouse willingly, ready to legally anchor my pristine professional record to his Ponzi scheme. He excused himself from his fake board members and marched over to us. He grabbed my elbow with a forceful, urgent grip, steering me away from the crowd. He guided me past the ice sculptures and the photography staging area, pushing open the heavy oak doors of a secluded VIP suite situated just off the main floor. The doors sealed shut behind us, instantly silencing the string quartet and the clinking glasses. The room was dim, featuring a single glass table, a leather sofa, and a mirrored bar. We were entirely alone. Julian did not waste a single second on pleasantries. The charming chief executive officer persona vanished. He snatched a titanium pen from his breast pocket and slammed it onto the glass table right next to the printed Chief Financial Officer Compliance Waiver. The thick parchment paper sat under the muted light, waiting for my signature. "The Apex Capital executives are taking the stage in 10 minutes, Julian hissed. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. He paced a tight circle around the glass table, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He pointed a trembling finger at the compliance waiver. "Sign the paper, Amelia. You do this right now, and I will delete the offshore tax files. I will not report you to the federal regulators. I will spare your miserable life and let you keep your little data entry job. Just put your name on the line, and we can both walk away clean." He was sweating. The stakes were crushing him. If I signed that document, Apex Capital would wire $40 million into his corporate accounts by Monday morning. He would quietly pay off the forged $4.2 million seed loan. He would erase my parents' secondary mortgage, saving them from eviction. He would dissolve the shell company and vanish, leaving me holding the legal liability if anyone ever audited the historical ledgers. I looked down at the forged document. The signature line waited for me to bind my identity to his toxic debts. I looked at the titanium pen resting on the cool glass. I did not reach for the pen. I did not open my black leather briefcase. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with my brother. The smug superiority on his face faltered a fraction of an inch as he registered my total lack of fear. I did not look like a broken scapegoat. I looked like an apex predator evaluating a wounded target. I stepped closer to him, invading his physical space. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing his anxiety to peak. "How is the weather in the Cayman Islands, Julian?" I whispered. Julian froze. The ambient noise of the string quartet filtering through the heavy walls seemed to vanish entirely. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The name of his secret offshore tax haven hung in the air like a localized storm front. He had spent the last 8 months setting up untraceable shell entities in Georgetown to hide the stolen venture capital. He utilized encrypted networks and proxy directors to obscure the cash flow. He believed his digital tracks were buried under impenetrable layers of international banking secrecy. Hearing me speak the name of his hidden sanctuary dismantled his carefully constructed reality. "What did you just say?" he stammered. His voice lacked its usual booming resonance. It sounded thin, hollow, and laced with raw terror. Before I could answer, the heavy oak doors clicked open and shut. Richard and Sylvia stepped into the dimly lit VIP room. They had followed us from the ballroom floor to serve as his designated enforcers. This was a classic tactical maneuver from our childhood. Whenever Julian needed me to take the blame for a broken window, a crashed car, or a failed college course, my parents would corner me in a closed room. They would create a physical barricade blocking the exit until I submitted to their demands. Sylvia wore a forced, confident smile, expecting to see me hovering over the glass table with pen in hand. Richard adjusted his silk tie, ready to offer fake paternal reassurance once the deed was done. They stopped dead in their tracks when they saw my rigid posture and Julian trembling hands. I calmly reached down and fastened the center button of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I said the $4.2 million you funneled through the Cayman accounts using my Social Security number has been frozen by federal regulators. I delivered the sentence with the clinical precision of a surgeon making a final incision. I had spent Thursday night analyzing the fragmented routing codes he used to bounce the venture capital across international borders. He utilized a network of shell corporations registered under variations of my name to shield his identity from federal tax auditors. When I contacted the compliance division of the offshore banking institution and provided my verified identification, they immediately locked the accounts pending a full fraud investigation. The capital was permanently inaccessible. The temperature in the room plummeted. I watched the specific stages of shock wash over the three people standing in front of me. For Julian, the statement confirmed that his Ponzi scheme was not just exposed, but financially paralyzed. He could no longer move the stolen funds to cover his tracks. For Richard, the frozen capital meant the secondary mortgage on their Westchester estate would default by the end of the current month. Richard had always been the silent architect of their dysfunction. He preferred to let Sylvia do the screaming while he managed the optics. Now, stripped of his carefully curated image, he looked like an old, hollow man. His country club membership, his golf outings, and his prestigious reputation were all vaporizing right in front of his eyes. He stared at the floor, his breathing shallow and rapid. He realized the $40 million buyout was their only lifeline, and I had just severed the rope. Sylvia reacted with unfiltered panic. The high society elegance she had spent 3 hours applying in front of a vanity mirror vanished in a fraction of a second. She let out a strangled, guttural gasp. She lunged forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. Her hands shot out, and she physically grabbed the lapels of my wool jacket. Her expensive sequined gown rustled loudly in the quiet room. "Sign the paper, Amelia," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the mirrored bar. "You are going to send your brother to prison. Do you understand what you are doing? You are destroying this family over a stupid grudge." I looked down at her hands gripping my clothing. She did not deny the fraud. She did not express shock that her son was a criminal orchestrating a massive corporate scam. She only expressed terror that he was going to face accountability. By screaming that I was sending him to prison, she openly admitted she knew about the forged signatures and the stolen venture capital. She had actively participated in the deception to maintain her elevated social status. I reached up and smoothly peeled her fingers off my suit, stepping back to maintain my physical perimeter. The realization that his mother was hyperventilating pushed Julian over the edge of rationality. The golden child had never faced a consequence he could not charm or buy his way out of. Now facing imminent federal wire fraud charges, his charm mutated into venom. He snatched the titanium pen off the glass table. His hands were shaking so violently that the metal casing rattled against his palm. He stepped directly into my space and pressed the tip of the pen hard against my chest, just above my collarbone. "If you ruin this buyout, I will make sure you never work again," Julian snarled. Spittle flew from his lips. He was no longer relying on fake Securities and Exchange Commission threats. He reverted to scorched earth sabotage. "I hired a digital firm last week. They generated dozens of highly realistic doctored photos of you engaging in illegal activities. If you walk out of this room without signing that compliance waiver, I will release those images to every major financial institution in this city. I will send them to your current employer. I will end your life, Amelia. You will be unemployable and destitute." He pressed the pen harder, attempting to use physical intimidation to extract a signature. He expected tears. He expected me to crumble under the weight of his fabricated scandal. For years, he had successfully bullied me into submission using the exact same blend of psychological pressure and fabricated evidence. But he was bullying a ghost. The frightened girl he remembered had died years ago, replaced by a senior corporate investigator who never walked into a hostile negotiation without a contingency plan. I did not push the pen away. I simply smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that finally made him hesitate. I slowly raised my right hand and tapped a small, dark, circular pin fastened to the lapel of my charcoal jacket. A tiny red light blinked steadily in the dim room. It was a micro-digital audio recorder linked directly to a live-streaming cloud server. Julian stared at the blinking light. The mechanics of his catastrophic mistake began to process in his mind. He had just threatened to distribute defamatory, doctored photographs to extort a federal signature. He had delivered a textbook confession to felony blackmail. He had also confirmed his knowledge of the fraudulent compliance waiver while standing in a room with witnesses. Sylvia covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a low, pathetic whimper. Richard took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the leather sofa. They were trapped in a recording of their own making. Their words were already digitized and stored in a remote vault far beyond their reach. Before Julian could retract the pen or attempt to snatch the recording device from my jacket, the heavy oak doors of the VIP room swung open. The sudden noise broke the suffocating tension. The bright lights of the grand ballroom spilled into the dark alcove, illuminating my brother-terrified face. Catherine Sinclair stepped over the threshold, her dark eyes sweeping across the scene. Catherine Sinclair stood perfectly still within the doorway of the dim alcove. She wore a tailored black suit that absorbed the ambient light, projecting a quiet, terrifying power. She did not glance at my mother-trembling hands. She did not acknowledge my father, pale, sweating face. She did not even look at the titanium pen Julian had just pressed against my collarbone. She treated my family with the ultimate crushing insult. She offered them total indifference. "It is time for the keynote announcement, Julian," she said. Her voice echoed with lethal authority, cutting through the heavy tension of the room. "The entire ballroom is waiting." She turned on her heel and walked back out into the glittering corridor. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind her. Julian lowered his arm. He shoved the pen back into his tuxedo pocket. He let out a long, shaky breath. In his desperate, narcissistic mind, he calculated the variables and reached a flawed, dangerous conclusion. He assumed Catherine had not heard the extortion threat. He believed the sealed doors had muffled his confession. He thought he still held the upper hand. He smoothed the lapels of his custom jacket. He turned to Richard and Sylvia, offering them a tight nod of reassurance. They desperately needed that lie to survive the next 10 minutes. Richard straightened his silk tie, clearing his throat. Sylvia wiped a bead of sweat from her upper lip and forced her theatrical smile back into place. They marched out of the VIP suite, stepping back into the bright light of the Plaza Hotel. I followed 5 paces behind them, carrying my structured black leather briefcase. The grand ballroom was buzzing with the electric energy of high finance. 300 of the most influential hedge fund managers, venture capitalists, and tech journalists in New York City occupied the floor. They were holding crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne. They were discussing stock portfolios and future market trends. Julian navigated through the sea of expensive silk and velvet, taking his designated seat at the primary front table located directly below the main stage. His supposed board of directors sat beside him. They patted his shoulder, offering premature congratulations on his impending wealth. Julian puffed out his chest. He looked around the room, soaking in the admiration. He was a man seconds away from a $40 million coronation. He believed his fabricated confidence had successfully shielded his hollow ledgers. The string quartet ceased playing. The overhead crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, directing all focus to the front of the room. Catherine Sinclair walked up the carpeted steps and approached the clear acrylic podium. She adjusted the slender silver microphone. A brief, sharp pulse of feedback silenced the remaining chatter. The room fell into a respectful, expectant hush. "Tonight we gathered to celebrate the future," Catherine began. Her voice rang across the silent, glittering space. It was a measured, resonant tone, utilized for delivering quarterly earnings reports to demanding shareholders. Apex Capital planned to acquire NovaStream. We prepared to issue a buyout valued at $40 million. Julian smiled broadly. He gripped the edge of the white tablecloth. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand up and wave to the applauding crowd. He was ready to accept his crown. He thought the offshore accounts were just a minor hurdle he could fix later. However, Catherine continued. That single word hung in the sterile air, dropping the temperature of the room to a glacial chill. Julian froze halfway out of his chair. Apex Capital relies on verified data, Catherine stated, looking up from her digital tablet. Transparency is the only currency we value. When our internal compliance team audited the historical ledgers of NovaStream, we did not find a revolutionary tech startup. We did not locate proprietary software. We did not verify a single legitimate licensing agreement. The silence in the ballroom mutated. It shifted from polite anticipation to sharp, terrifying confusion. The venture capitalists sitting near the front table lowered their champagne glasses. The journalists raised their recording devices. Instead, Catherine projected her voice to reach the furthest corners of the hall. We found a ghost ship. We uncovered a $4.2 million Ponzi scheme built on forged identities and stolen seed capital. We traced millions of dollars routed illegally into offshore tax havens. We found a textbook execution of federal wire fraud. The ballroom erupted in a collective, deafening gasp. The sheer magnitude of the accusation delivered by a billionaire private equity chief sent shockwaves through the crowd. Julian's physical body gave out. He collapsed backward into his chair. His spine hit the upholstery with a heavy thud. He stared at the stage, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His fake empire evaporated into thin air, leaving him exposed as a broke, unemployed criminal. The charismatic tech visionary vanished. In his place sat a terrified fraudster facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Sylvia buried her face in her hands. She let out a high-pitched wail that was quickly drowned out by the rising murmur of the crowd. Richard sat paralyzed. He watched the influential country club members he had spent decades trying to impress step physically away from his table. The board of directors sitting next to Julian scrambled out of their seats. They practically sprinted toward the perimeter of the room, terrified of being legally associated with a federal crime. My family was suddenly surrounded by an empty, isolating void. The crowd began to shout questions. The noise escalated into a chaotic roar. Investors realized their initial seed money was gone, squandered on luxury car leases and fake corporate retreats. They realized Julian had stolen their capital to fund his own vanity. Catherine raised her right hand. The commanding gesture instantly silenced the chaotic room. She demanded order, and the financial elite provided it. "I am officially pulling all funding," Catherine announced, delivering the final lethal blow. "The acquisition is canceled, effective immediately. My legal team has already forwarded our complete audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Federal authorities are reviewing the ledgers tonight." She paused, letting the reality of federal intervention settle over Julian's rigid shoulders. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. Richard stared at his empty plate, realizing his secondary mortgage was now a ticking time bomb. The bank would take his pristine Westchester estate. The illusion of his high society life was dead. "But I cannot take credit for uncovering this massive criminal enterprise," Catherine stated, shifting her dark gaze across the silent room. "Apex Capital did not find the forged signatures or the hidden Cayman accounts. The architect of this forensic audit is in the room tonight." Catherine stood at the clear acrylic podium. The silent room waited. She looked down at the front table. Her dark eyes locked onto my horrified parents. "For 30 years, the Dutton family introduced Julian as their pride and joy," Catherine announced. Her voice resonated with crystal clarity, cutting through the heavy tension of the ballroom. "They paraded him at every gathering, celebrating accomplishments he never actually earned. They introduced Amelia as an afterthought. She was the quiet girl who processed data to pay rent. She was a background character in their curated suburban play." Catherine paused, letting the weight of those decades settle over the crowd. She understood the precise mechanics of familial scapegoating. They needed her to remain small so his fabricated light could shine brighter. "So tonight I would like to officially introduce her with the title she actually earned." She extended her hand toward the perimeter where I stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Senior Director of Corporate Intelligence for Apex Capital, Amelia Dutton. The sheer magnitude of the shock hit my family like a physical blow. Julian's jaw unhinged. The arrogant tech visionary persona disintegrated into a puddle of raw panic. He had spent the last week sending extortion demands to my corporate email server. He thought he was intimidating a low-level clerk. Instead, he had put federal blackmail in writing on the secure servers of the exact private equity firm evaluating his buyout. He had threatened the top forensic executive of his sole buyer. Richard clutched his chest, his knuckles turning white against his expensive silk tie. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. He realized the woman he had dismissed during countless country club dinners was the architect of his impending bankruptcy. Sylvia let out a pathetic wail. The sound scraped against the acoustic panels of the ballroom. Her mind rapidly connected the catastrophic dots. For the past 2 days, she had mobilized a public smear campaign. She had even attempted to call my employer to demand my termination. She now realized she had spent her Thursday afternoon leaving unhinged voicemails for a billionaire chief executive officer, demanding the firing of her most trusted investigator. The social hierarchy she worshipped collapsed instantly. I stepped out of the shadows. The ambient light of the crystal chandeliers caught the sharp lines of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not walk with the hesitant, shuffled steps my mother had conditioned me to use. For years, she forced me into cheap, faded dresses to visually cement my inferior status. Tonight, I wore the armor of my profession. I moved with the steady, rhythmic cadence of an auditor arriving to balance a terminal ledger. The crowd parted. The venture capitalists and hedge fund managers stepped backward, creating a wide path to the center of the ballroom floor. They recognized the sudden shift in power. I carried my structured black leather briefcase. I set it down gently onto a vacant high-top table draped in white silk. The metallic click of the brass latches echoed sharply through the silent hall. I opened the lid. Inside rested 100 printed forensic dossiers. They were bound in premium parchment paper, legally certified and chronologically organized. They contained the undeniable anatomy of a massive financial crime. I extracted the first heavy stack of dossiers. I walked directly to the front table. Julian, lead investor, sat 2 chairs away from my brother. He was a prominent angel investor who had blindly trusted Julian's initial pitch 3 years ago, funneling millions into the hollow startup. I handed the thick folder directly into his hands. His eyes darted from my face to the heavy document. I handed the second dossier to a distinguished older man standing near the photography staging area. He was the president of the elite Westchester Country Club my mother idolized. Sylvia had spent a decade groveling for his approval, pouring her secret secondary mortgage funds into his charity luncheons, just to secure a seat at his table. He took the folder with a grim expression. I continued moving through the crowd, distributing the physical evidence to journalists, banking executives, and regulatory compliance officers. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with smooth, clinical detachment. Page 4 details the forged signatures on the initial seed funding applications, I said, handing a file to a reporter. You will see a verified handwriting analysis confirming Sylvia Dutton signed my name to secure a $4.2 million commercial loan. I took another step, offering a dossier to a prominent hedge fund manager. Page 12 contains the transcript of the extortion threat, recorded less than 20 minutes ago in the VIP suite. I continued. Julian Dutton explicitly promised to release doctored photographs to sabotage my career if I refused to sign a compliance waiver masking his Ponzi scheme. The rustling of heavy paper filled the ballroom. The financial elite opened the folders. Their eyes scanned the highlighted routing numbers, the zero revenue tax filings, and the exposed offshore Cayman accounts. The murmurs escalated into sharp gasps of outrage. The lead investor slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the champagne flutes. He realized his millions were gone, squandered on luxury leases and fake corporate retreats. The country club president looked at Sylvia with profound disgust, stepping physically away from her proximity. He realized her entire membership was funded by stolen capital. The pristine illusion my parents had built was vaporized. They were exposed as common fraudsters, standing in the center of the most exclusive room in Manhattan. Julian shrank into his chair. The crushing weight of the evidence pinned him to the upholstery. He looked desperately toward the exit. He calculated the distance to the service elevators, plotting a frantic escape into the freezing city night. He thought he could run. He thought he could slip out the back doors and locate a burner phone to access whatever scraps of capital remained in his hidden accounts. He placed his hands on the armrests, preparing to bolt. The crowd was too busy reading the ledgers to notice his shifting posture. Richard reached out to grab his son's arm, a silent plea to stay and face the wreckage. But Julian yanked his sleeve away. He took one step backward, away from the table. Before Julian could take a second step, the perimeter of the ballroom shifted. The timing was orchestrated with the same microscopic precision I applied to my corporate audits. At the exact moment the financial elite digested the depth of the wire fraud, the massive double doors at the main entrance burst open. The heavy brass handles slammed against the marble walls. The sharp noise severed the remaining chatter. 6 individuals stepped over the threshold. They did not wear tuxedos or evening gowns. They wore dark, tactical windbreakers with stark yellow lettering printed across the back and chest. Federal agents. They marched in perfect unison, their heavy boots striking the floor in a rhythmic countdown to the end of the fake empire. They bypassed the stunned investors and moved in a straight, unyielding line directly toward Julian. The federal agents moved with tactical precision. They bypassed the stunned hedge fund managers and stepped directly into Julian's path. My brother stumbled backward. His spine collided with the edge of the front table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes. He raised his hands in a frantic, disjointed gesture of surrender. The lead agent did not read him his rights in a gentle, accommodating tone. She grabbed Julian by the shoulder, spun him around, and forced his wrists behind his back. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed sharply across the silent ballroom. The cold metal stood in stark contrast to the tailored Italian silk of his custom tuxedo. Julian looked desperately over his shoulder, seeking rescue from the parents who had protected him for 3 decades. Richard and Sylvia offered no salvation. They stood paralyzed, watching the golden child escorted toward the freight elevators like a common thief. The venture capitalists, the journalists, and the country club elite did not gasp or whisper. They simply watched the procession in profound disgust. They realized they had just shared drinks with a fraudster. I remained standing near the acrylic podium, my posture straight and my breathing steady. The performance was over. The theater had been dismantled, and the actors were finally forced to face the raw, unedited script of their own choices. The ensuing weeks executed a brutal sequence of consequences. Without the $40 million acquisition to plug the bleeding, NovaStream imploded overnight. The Securities and Exchange Commission froze every domestic account associated with the startup. The Department of Justice unsealed a 20-count indictment against Julian, charging him with federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. His highly paid defense attorneys demanded steep retainers up front, but the offshore Cayman accounts remained locked under international investigation. Denied bail due to his explicit flight risks, the charismatic chief executive officer traded his penthouse suite for a concrete cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center. The financial shockwave did not stop with my brother. It traveled directly up the family tree, striking my parents with mathematical certainty. Richard and Sylvia had gambled their entire suburban existence on the success of a Ponzi scheme. They took out a massive secondary mortgage to keep Julian afloat, hiding the debt behind their curated country club persona. When the regional retail bank realized the primary collateral was tied to an active federal criminal case, they triggered an immediate default clause. The grace period vanished. 30 days after the Plaza Hotel Gala, a county sheriff walked up the sprawling driveway of the Westchester estate. He bypassed the manicured rose bushes and pinned a neon foreclosure notice directly to the heavy mahogany front door. My parents were given less than a week to vacate the premises. They possessed no liquid capital to hire professional movers. The luxury vehicles in their garage were repossessed by the leasing agencies. Stripped of their wealth and abandoned by the society friends who now viewed them as toxic liabilities, Richard and Sylvia packed their remaining clothes into black plastic bags. They relocated to a cramped, drafty apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The pristine suburban dream mutated into a depressing reality of stained carpets and rattling radiators. Furthermore, federal prosecutors began circling their involvement in the initial seed funding forgery. They faced pending accessory charges for facilitating the identity theft that launched the fake empire. The pristine socialites were reduced to desperate suspects, waiting for the legal hammer to drop. 60 days after the arrest, I sat at the glass desk in my Tribeca penthouse. The evening sun cast long, warm shadows across the hardwood floor. My personal cell phone illuminated. The caller identification displayed an unknown prepaid burner number. My upgraded security protocols filtered out their standard contacts, but desperation breeds persistence. I picked up the device and pressed the accept button. Amelia, a ragged voice, gasped through the speaker. It was Sylvia. The theatrical high society elegance she spent her life perfecting was gone. She sounded exhausted, hollowed out by the crushing weight of poverty and impending litigation. In the background, I heard the faint, depressing wail of a highway siren. "Please do not hang up," she sobbed, her breath catching in her throat. I remained silent, letting the encrypted connection transmit her panic. "We have nothing left," Sylvia pleaded. "Your father is working a minimum wage retail shift just to keep the lights on. The public defender says Julian is facing 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The prosecutors are looking at our bank records now. You have to pay our legal fees. You have a massive salary. You have to hire us a defense team. We are your blood. Family protects family." She deployed the very same manipulative phrases she used to trap me during my childhood. She expected the familiar guilt to override my logic. She assumed the biological connection served as an unbreakable contract demanding infinite forgiveness and endless financial bailouts. I listened to her hyperventilate, searching my chest for a single ounce of pity. I found zero. The empty space was filled with the quiet, unbothered peace of a balanced ledger. "You introduced me as an afterthought," I replied coldly, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "You viewed my existence as a convenient shield to protect your real investment. Now, your investment is bankrupt, and you want to cash out the insurance policy you spent 30 years degrading." I paused, letting the cold reality of the statement settle into the drafty walls of her cheap apartment. "Consider this my final thought about you. Do not call this number again." I tapped the red icon on my screen, severing the connection. I opened the security settings and permanently blocked the burner line. The silence that followed was rich, satisfying, and entirely mine. The ultimate resolution, however, arrived the following week. Catherine Sinclair rewarded my forensic execution with a substantial corporate bonus, honoring the millions of dollars I saved Apex Capital from investing into a void. I did not purchase a sports car or a designer wardrobe. I directed the capital toward a highly specific, poetic investment. The regional bank listed the foreclosed Westchester estate at a public auction, desperate to liquidate the tainted property. Using my new capital, I purchased my parents' former kingdom for pennies on the dollar. The deed transferred into my name alone, free of hidden mortgages and forged signatures. I drove up to the property on a crisp Tuesday morning. The sprawling colonial house sat quiet and empty, a monument to greed and manufactured illusions. I did not unlock the front door. I did not step inside to reminisce about a childhood that never truly existed. I stood on the edge of the street holding a thermos of dark roast coffee and offered a brief nod to the site manager standing next to me. He keyed his radio. The heavy diesel engines of 3 massive yellow bulldozers roared to life. The steel treads tore through the manicured rose bushes and the pristine front lawn. The heavy mechanical arms raised high into the air and slammed downward, crushing the roof and shattering the elegant bay windows. The house folded inward, collapsing under the sheer force of the machinery. Wood splintered, glass broke, and decades of toxic history crumbled into a pile of unrecognizable rubble. I watched the demolition with a profound, steady calm. I had the entire structure razed down to the bare dirt. The foundation was ripped from the earth, erasing any physical trace of the Dutton family legacy. I did not keep the land for myself. I transferred the sprawling acreage into a charitable trust, utilizing the remainder of my corporate bonus to fund a new construction project. Upon the ashes of my parents' fraudulent empire, an architectural team laid the groundwork for a fully funded transition center. The facility provided secure housing, legal representation, and financial literacy training for women escaping economic abuse. The capital they tried to steal from me now served to protect others from enduring the same silent extortion. The shadows were banished. The vault was locked. The ledger was finally closed. I stand today on the freshly poured concrete of the new transition center. The winter wind blowing off the Hudson River feels crisp and grounding. The fraudulent empire my parents built is nothing but a memory, buried beneath the solid foundation of a sanctuary designed to protect the vulnerable. Looking back at the wreckage of Julian erased tech startup and my parents' foreclosed suburban kingdom, I do not feel guilt. I only feel the profound clarity that comes from balancing a terminal ledger. Surviving a predatory family requires more than just emotional endurance. It requires a tactical shift in how you navigate the world. Through the process of dismantling their deception, I learned 5 permanent lessons. First, I learned that verified data is the ultimate armor against manipulation. Toxic individuals thrive in the gray areas of emotional warfare, twisting memories and projecting guilt to maintain control. They cannot argue with printed routing numbers, bank statements, and certified corporate filings. Emotions fade, and gaslighting confuses the mind, but forensic documentation leaves a permanent, undeniable scar on their narrative. Second, I learned the staggering tactical advantage of silence. When you stop reacting to their manufactured crises, you deprive them of the oxygen they need to survive. Narcissists expect you to defend yourself. When you simply walk away and refuse to engage, they panic. That panic drives them to make careless, fatal mistakes, like putting federal blackmail in writing. Third, I learned to never surrender my legal identity to satisfy a familial demand. The moment you sign a document without reading the fine print to keep the peace, you hand your abusers a loaded weapon. Your credit history, your signature, and your financial perimeter must remain heavily fortified. No holiday dinner or birthday gathering is worth the price of federal wire fraud. Fourth, I learned that shared DNA is merely a biological fact, not a binding contract for infinite financial bailouts. Society conditions us to believe we must set ourselves on fire to keep our relatives warm. Loyalty is a reciprocal currency. If someone views you as a disposable asset or a convenient scapegoat, you owe them nothing. You have every right to cut the dead weight from your portfolio. Fifth, I learned that true retribution is not about inflicting pain upon your abusers. True retribution is building a beautiful, unbothered life that they can never touch. It is waking up in a secure home, bought with your own capital. It is using the very resources they tried to steal to fund the protection of others. Success built on a foundation of truth is the ultimate revenge. If you are sitting in the shadow of a toxic family right now, wondering how much longer you have to play the role of the obedient background character, I want you to know your own strength. You do not have to absorb their liabilities. You can step out of the alcove, refuse to sign their waivers, and walk into the sunlight. Pack your bags in silence, lock down your finances, and let them face the consequences of their own ledgers. If this story resonated with you and you are ready to stop being the scapegoat in your own life, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. Share your own experiences in the comments below, because your voice matters here. Build your fortress, protect your peace, and remember that the pen is always in your hand.